Hello. Today we're going to take a deep dive into John Rutter's much-loved Christmas tune, What Sweeter Music. What Sweeter Music represents two very English choral institutions. One is the famous Festival of Nine Lessons and Carols at King's College, Cambridge, which is broadcast to the nation every Christmas Eve. And the other is the composer, John Rutter. His music has been ubiquitous, especially among English parish church choirs, for decades now. And his name is known to nearly every English choral singer, not least because it's on the front of an incredibly widely used set of English Christmas carol books. Rutter wrote this particular carol for the King's College service in 1987, setting a rather charming 17th century poem by Robert Herrick. The poem was originally written as a kind of play, apparently to be performed to the king. Rutter edits the words to make them more amenable to his musical ideas, sadly removing the most entertainingly weird verse, but that's another story. The music is in Rutter's very distinctive, not to say predictable, style. It's built around a central melody, in this case a really gorgeous one, and it starts with sopranos laying out that melody in unison. From there, the baton passes to the tenors and basses, and then some harmony breaks out, and you know the rest. Since this one melody runs through the whole piece in one form or another, I think the best way to approach teaching it is to start by having everyone familiarise themselves with the melody. I would ask the full choir to sing the soprano line from the beginning, then to switch to the tenor line at bar 12 and carry on. This won't be too much hassle because some singers will probably know it anyway, and also, did I mention, it's a gorgeous melody. It's fun here to ask upper voices to read the bass clef, supported by tenors and basses of course. It's good practice and it gives them an appreciation of how the other half lives. And when the basses complain about being asked to sing a top G, you can smugly point out that it's actually a G flat so they can shut up. Though, admittedly, it does look terrifying if you're a bass. Of course, you're not just teaching the melody here, you're also laying the groundwork for several other important components of the piece, which you'll return to in later rehearsals, and of course we'll cover those in detail later in the video. I think with this piece, the number of these elements you want to add during the first sing-through will depend on your singer's pace of learning and sight reading. I suspect this romantic, melody-led type of music will be largely intuitive for most choirs, at least stylistically, which means you can choose just to let it flow on the first pass, maybe stopping only to correct note errors, and that will still be valuable. Or, if it suits your style and your choir better, you can be a bit more demanding of details as you go along. The trick, anyway, is to find a good balance for your singers, so they can start to form important habits right from the beginning without getting totally bogged down on the first pass. Once you've sung through that opening melody, you can then take on the rest of the piece section by section, because really 90% of the piece is a development of, or variation on, or restatement of that first page. And it's written in a way that you can break up those sections and tackle them individually, on different rehearsal nights if you need to. You don't have to do them in order either. For instance, I think that no matter which section or sections I chose to work on in the first rehearsal, I would still want to finish that first rehearsal with the last recapitulation, the unison melody that starts in bar 63. It's a satisfying end to the work they've done, and it will leave your singers with a sense of achievement but still keen to come back and explore more of the piece next time. By the way, a footnote. There is another way to begin teaching this piece if you have accomplished singers and you worry that dragging everyone through the opening melody will seem a bit patronising. You can just start in bar 36 with exactly the same melody, but this time some fairly interesting four-part harmony. If you do that and everyone reads it smoothly, then you can basically completely skip rehearsing the first verse for now, because by the time the choirs work through the rest of the song, the first page almost goes without saying. I said that the style of this piece will be intuitive for most choirs. That does not mean that the melody itself is predictable, nor in fact the harmonies. Kudos actually to Rutter for writing a tune that's lovely and memorable and still interesting without descending into cliché on this occasion. Of course, interesting also means there are some traps for the unwary. Mostly these traps are set by the lovely lyrical jumps up and down that the melody is full of. There is no choir that's too good for you to ask them just to carefully sing the intervals in bar 5. La 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 la. The F needs to be nice and bright there. Similarly with this phrase, bar 7, and this one, bar 9, and this one, bars 19 to 20, and so on. You get the idea. When it comes to sight reading, the fact that it's written in G-flat major is mostly no big deal. Normally, a nice thing about being a singer rather than an instrumentalist is that you don't need to worry about that kind of thing unless you happen to have perfect pitch. 6 flats in the key signature? Don't care, just imagine it's 1 sharp and sing. Until you hit an accidental. Second soprano's F flat, F natural? Of course, it's easy when you've heard it once, but that's what note bashing is for. In the same vein, some sight reading looks much harder than it really is. All the natural signs in this phrase, bars 53 to 57, are entirely a distraction from what is entirely conventional B-flat major. Oh yeah, and there's a sudden clef change for tenors too, thanks OUP. While I'm complaining about the publisher, you might well need to check the second sopranos also in bars 45 onwards. Not because their line is hard at all, but because, again, 1980s OUP wanted to cram this whole piece onto 8 pages, and they kind of threw legibility under the bus. This is not the only place where the layout of the score is your enemy. The evolving key change here for tenors and basses is lovely. First into C-flat and then into B-flat, but they may need to hear it before they can sing it. And let's be really careful on the tuning here too. I'd be happy if they could tune that last chord on heart by ear without the accompaniment. Now we get to the question of finesse and fine detail. Buckle in, because there is a lot to say about this piece. I don't call this channel Deep Dive for nothing. Firstly, the melody's leaps shouldn't make the words stick out. The words are beautifully set, we expect nothing less from Rutter. But it's always the rhythmic shape, not the melodic shape, that should guide where the emphasis falls. Here's the contrast I mean. What sweeter music can we bring versus what sweeter music can we bring? A carol for to sing versus a carol for to sing. And give the honour versus and give the honour to this day. You get the point. Sudden high notes shouldn't mean emphasis. Bar lines are the guide to emphasis. This principle also helps us resolve ambiguous phrases, such as night fly hence away, which could kind of make sense, but is not what Rutter intends. Instead, it's the more natural night fly hence away. There is a lovely intelligent move that Rutter makes later in the piece to preserve this connection between rhythmic shape and lyrical emphasis. Compare the melody for Fly Hence Away and so on with the same melody for The Darling of the World Is Come. Spot the difference? Rutter's moved the bar lines. He's displaced the strong beat by 1 beat. Because the poem has done the same. If you'd kept the original bar lines, we'd have this weird pattern. The darling of the world is come and fit it is. Now, that sounds like a Tannoy announcement, but tweak the bar lines and justice is restored. This explains, of course, why Rutter needs that 4/4 bar later on, bar 52, where the stress is momentarily ambiguous. He needs to get things lined up right again in time for the next verse. There's more going on here than meets the eye. Now, it's one thing to appreciate that rhythmic shape should trump melodic shape, but how do we actually do it? You don't want singers to start leaning heavily on the first beat of each bar in an attempt to kind of ram through this lesson. For instance, in bar 21, we don't want why does the chilling winters mourn, but we also don't want to fix that problem and end up with why does the chilling winters mourn? What's required is actually the opposite, not to lean on the strong beats, but to back off on the weaker ones when they're melodically more prominent. In other words, to keep the emphasis subtle. Chilling winter's morn. Or to exaggerate a bit, do, 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 do. This de-stressing, as it were, of prominent notes can feel counterintuitive to a choir if they're not used to it. But it is a really good skill to work on. It's one that's useful in many different styles of singing, and it's really great how vividly this piece lays it out. The most important instance of this is that octave leap to a top G flat in the main tune, Awake the Voice. It's marked with a crescendo, which is fine, but you absolutely don't need to think about the crescendo here, for two reasons. One, the octave leap makes the crescendo happen in the ear of the listener anyway, so if you add your own literal volume increase on top of that, it's too much. And two, nearly all singers ought to be switching register here, and if you ask them to think about crescendoing through that switch, you risk an ugly sound or a break in the flow. And worse still, singers might try to compensate for that by not switching register as they leap up, and then you get an ugly effect, which I won't try to replicate here in case you're listening with headphones. Instead of all this, the message to singers on passages like this is, don't think crescendo, just think breath support and float the high note gently, and the audience will think they heard a lovely crescendo anyway. Here's some more general advice about making this piece work. Enunciation of the words. It's slow and luxurious and lyrical, so there's plenty of space to be very clear about words. Thinking about the rhythmic emphasis, as we've just covered, will give you a lot of word clarity for free, but you still have to think about consonants. At this speed and in this style of singing, it's a genuine option to say things like, music can we bring, without sounding overly fussy. And in fact, that's how Rutter's own choir does it. Listen. If you'll be performing in a relatively spacious acoustic like a church, you can even ask for slightly over-aspirated, that is, spitty consonants. What sweeter music! This will feel silly, of course, in a small rehearsal room with such a warm legato piece, but it will sound entirely natural in a larger performance space. Intelligent phrasing and breathing. For instance, verse 1, no breath after bring, breath after carol, no breath after sing. Again, plenty of space to do these things without seeming fussy. Listen again to the opening and hear how natural it can sound. But then you as a conductor need to plan carefully in advance where you're going to do these things and where you're not. Because the principle, just follow the punctuation, will not work as a blanket rule for this piece. The last thing you want is tenors and basses trying to breathe mid-triplet after smile in bar 22, for instance, or to run into that top G flat in bar 27 without having had a good breath to prepare after Sean. Your job is to take these into account, yes, words and punctuation, but also melody and performance needs, and to make all those breathing decisions ahead of time so you can simply instruct singers about what you want, ideally with your conducting gestures, so you don't need to waste their time reading off a list. The details are important, but it's really not worth getting bogged down in arguing about these things during rehearsal. Next, dynamics. Rutter mostly tells you what he wants, so your first job is to observe that. But within those instructions, you'll also want some fairly luxurious phrasing. This is one of those things that could theoretically be accomplished by telling the choir to get their pencils out and write in each small hairpin in each bar. And I think we've all known a few conductors who like to work that way. But I think you're better off giving some overall guidance and a few examples, and then trusting musicians in front of you to do an intelligent job, which you can then tweak and unify in rehearsal where you need to, and of course lead in performance with your gestures. One example I like to give in slow music like this is how to add momentum at the ends of phrases by dwelling momentarily on the longer notes and warming them through. That's the phrase I usually use to try and encourage a subtle crescendo without the tenors wrecking it. We see him come and know him It's easy to overdo this, but done really gently it can help the piece move along and give each phrase some shape. And although it's not really very important, I find that highlighting just one detail like this in rehearsal can sometimes flick a switch in singers' heads. Then they start doing other good things too without having to point them out. I guess more generally, one element of this piece which needs some careful thought is where you should over-egg the phrasing, Eric Whitacre style, and where you should be more subtle and restrained, Carols from Kings style. There are definitely opportunities to do both, and I would say it's not just one setting of the dial for the whole piece. For instance, I like to ask tenors and basses to give it some egg in the verse about the chilling winter's morn, because without that there's a danger they sound reticent. But for the unison recap at the end, marked molto dolce, I prefer a really straight performance with no attempt to overdo things. Your mileage may vary. Then there were just a few more things I wanted to mention. Bar 10, don't swallow the k in awake, awake the. Bar 13, not a snappy dotted rhythm but a smooth one, fly hence away. Bar 17, make sure the tenor melody is still clear even when it's below the basses. Ask the basses to sing more sensitively to compensate, rather than telling tenors to be louder. Bar 20, take your time on this break. Let the audience wait for the melody they're about to hear before they hear it. Bar 31, very subtle alto movement, don't lean on the early G flat. Bar 35, be very careful to have nice diction on the under earth, a smooth vowel switch between the and under, not a glide, and then no R in under earth. Just the note change and a change of facial expression will be enough. Listen. Bar 36 onwards, when you lose the accompaniment, here's your chance to be a bit elastic with the tempo. Enjoy the relaxation at the ends of phrases, then make the triplets roll along nicely. Know him as who with his sunshine. Bar 40 and all places like this, make sure the duplets under the triplets are very, very gentle. No spitty consonants here. It should just add lilt for the audience, not really be a noticeable detail. Yeah, bars 45 to 49, tenors should be almost invisible. Listen. Bar 60 is the only forte in the piece, but it's poco and it's momentary, and there are no sopranos, so make it a lovely warm sound, not a forceful one. Finally, who can resist augmenting that writ in bar 71 with a short pause on the last beat? If you've watched this far and you're still with me, congratulations. If you fast forwarded a bit, I don't blame you. You might reasonably be thinking, come on, this is a sweet little Christmas carol, not a baroque cantata. Fussing over every note and comma will spoil it. And actually, I agree, kind of. I mean, there are two different risks here. One is that you spoil the piece in rehearsal by being overly fussy about everything and not letting the choir get into the music as a whole. The other risk is that you spoil the piece for the audience by giving a performance that sounds overly fussy and obscuring the simple appeal of the music. On the first point, I agree this is a risk, but don't misinterpret what I'm trying to do here. In this video, as with other deep dives, I wanted to burrow right down into the music to show the kinds of things that you as a conductor might want to think about when you're preparing this piece. But I'd never suggest that you should be reeling off all this stuff to your choir. That would be tedious, to put it mildly. I always think that running a choir rehearsal is rather like teaching a class. It's more teaching skill and group psychology than it is pure subject knowledge. When I'm preparing to teach a new piece, I mean in general, not just this piece, I suppose I try to mentally divide the things that come into my head into about 4 groups. First, there's those elements that I expect I'll want to talk about or demonstrate explicitly. In this case, the stuff about breathing and phrasing might go in this category. Then there's those elements that I won't need to mention at all because they already know them, or they'll cotton on to them just by singing the piece and applying their own musicality. Thirdly, there's elements that I hope I can communicate without explicitly talking about them. For instance, in the conducting gestures I use or the way I sing examples, or sometimes by sleight of hand. For instance, asking singers to pay attention to each other's vowel sounds when what I really want to improve is their tuning. The more stuff you can shunt into this third category, the more efficient and enjoyable and smooth your rehearsals will be. But you can't take this too far. Don't believe anyone who tells you that everything can go in this category, but that's just nonsense. And sometimes talking is the easiest and most efficient way to communicate. And then finally, there are things that I simply don't expect us to be able to worry about. These are either not important enough to me, or not sufficiently within the grasp of the choir in the time we have, or the payoff wouldn't be worth the effort. Now, it is, of course, honestly okay to put things in this fourth category too. Sometimes lots of things. And where to draw this line between things that are achievable and things that aren't will be different for every group and indeed every conductor. It's very rare that we as conductors have the luxury of so much rehearsal time and such a compliant and dedicated choir that we can tick every single possible box for every piece of music we rehearse. In fact, I might even suggest that if you do find yourself in that situation, you need to correct it by choosing some more challenging music. So my point is, when you look at a huge pile of musical details that looms at you from a new piece, or listen to me droning on for the best part of half an hour about a simple carol, don't think, oh no, I can't work on all this because it'll ruin the rehearsals. Instead think, all right, how much of this matters to me? How much of that can we achieve without ruining rehearsals? And what are the priorities to focus on? To an extent, that answers the second worry too. That's the worry that your performance might end up sounding overly fussy so the audience can't enjoy it properly. I mean, yes, if you're cramming in so much detail that it ruins it for the audience, then you're doing it wrong. But at the same time, it's the job of the singers to do any necessary fiddly work in a way that produces a non-fiddly impression to the audience. It's like the hackneyed analogy of the swan gliding across the water while its feet paddle frantically below the surface. And while that definitely goes for singers, it counts double for the conductor. Our job as conductors is to let the singers offload as much of that mental effort as possible onto ourselves, and then to kind of deliver it back to them on the night, bit by bit, through the way we conduct the music. Making it possible for them to do a lot of detailed work to make a piece effective without sounding like or even feeling like they're doing it. Anyway, that was quite a long diversion. My point here was just that, yeah, the list of ideas I've run through in this video is far too long, but as with any piece of music you can think of, you've got to pick and choose from that list to work on what suits you, your choir and your audience. If you don't do that picking and choosing, then you either cram in too much, or leave out too much, or make your enjoyment of the piece and the audience experience a hostage to whatever happens to cross your mind. And that's a shame. So, I'm sorry that this video is about 8 times as long as Rutter's piece. I think I've probably said enough, and I hope at least some of it was partly useful. Please do enjoy What Sweeter Music. As I said right at the top, I think it's one of the old man's finest, and it's just as pleasing for the choir as for the audience. I hope you enjoyed this unseasonably deep dive into Christmas. My name is Toby Wardman, and I have lots of these videos already online, each one about a different piece, obviously. But there's currently a bit of a bias towards schmaltz, so maybe it's time to shake things